He slipped a small, cracked porcelain cup across the table and told her to buy whatever she wanted. Ethan Locke had built skyscrapers, venture funds, and a public image that felt untouchable, but the penthouse mirror told a different story, one of hollow dinners and carefully curated friends. Around him were three people who lived inside his orbit: his girlfriend Ava, who appeared on glossy pages, his executive assistant Marcus, who managed his calendar and his image, and Rosa, the maid, who had been in his building longer than some of his companies had existed. He offered them something absurd, a test dressed as generosity, and promised only that the truth would emerge when the receipts came back. If you want to see how a single bizarre purchase can rearrange an empire of assumptions, stay with this story. If stories that change the way you see people matter to you, subscribe. The city below was a smear of lights and distant horns. The air in the penthouse smelled faintly of lemon polish and old coffee, and that brusque cup on the table made everything feel smaller, closer, inevitable. You are about to witness choices that will undo masks and build unlikely bridges. Now, sit back. This is one of those stories that will change how you judge a single act. He called it an experiment in the privacy of his living room, but the experiment had rules only to him. Marcus answered the call first, frowning at the logistics. "Ethan, what do you mean unlimited?" Marcus asked, voice practiced, late-night fatigue in it. "Use a card for 72 hours, no oversight, bring me receipts," Ethan said, and Marcus laughed in a way that tried to look amused and concerned at once. Ava texted a heart emoji and asked if it was for charity or a stunt. Rosa wiped a countertop and smiled without moving her mouth, small hands steady even when surprised. Ethan wanted to know who would choose spectacle, who would choose leverage, and who, if anyone, would translate access into care. When he handed out 3 cards in velvet sleeves, the reactions diverged like paths from a crossroads. Ava flipped her hair, the card bright against her manicured nails. Marcus examined the chip and an app notification on his phone. Rosa turned the sleeve over and over, the paper crinkling softly under her thumb, and then tucked it into the pocket of her apron like a talisman. The apartment hummed with the low pedal of a late elevator downstairs. The rule was simple, he said aloud. Hold the cards for 72 hours. Use them without asking. No reports until the end. He wanted receipts. He wanted truth. Ava went first into a world that reflected her reflection. She called friends, arranged a reservation at an exclusive restaurant, and sent stories to her followers. "I have something wild tonight," she whispered into the phone, lipstick already applied. A stylist arrived with a trunk of silk and sequins, the scent of hairspray and champagne following them through the door. At a boutique, she asked for pieces that screamed headlines, let salespeople unfurl garments like flags. A store window swallowed her silhouette, and the flash of cameras made everything cinematic. Her receipts would come later, long and glossy like the magazines she loved. Marcus used the card like a chess piece. He booked meetings at members-only clubs, bought table bookings next to venture partners, paid for introductions that had a price measured in attention. "This is about positioning," he explained to an associate named Julia over a video call, tapping through the guest lists and sponsorship tiers. He set up a lunch at a private room where he could talk about partnership terms for Ethan's next fund. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with confirmations and LinkedIn messages that smelled of opportunity. Strategy was visible in every line item he charged. Rosa moved through the city differently. She walked to a market that smelled of coriander and frying dough. She bought boxes of rice and cheap soaps, paid a neighborhood seamstress to mend a coat, and left small envelopes at a community center whose doorbell she had pressed 100 times as a child. Rosa did not post anything. The cashier at the market folded a paper receipt and pressed a few coins from a drawer. The fabric of the coat smelled like mustard and street smoke when she carried it home. Her purchases added up quietly, almost invisibly against the noise of glitter and negotiation. At the 1/3 mark of this story, we pause and ask you to take a breath and reflect on your reaction so far. Maybe you are judging already and picking sides. That is expected. Now do something small for the conversation. If you were Ethan, who would you trust more? A for Ava, B for Marcus, or C for Rosa. Type just one letter and one line why. Your comment helps others see different points of view and helps us build stories that teach as much as they reveal. Thank you for being part of this community. Now we return to the receipts and the soft weight of choices. Days folded into receipts and images. Ava's purchases were cinematic. She posted velvet close-ups, a series of videos with warm filters and slow pans, friends laughing over a table strewn with oysters, the clink of glass recorded like applause. In one shop, she bought a vintage watch that made a sales assistant cry because the story she wove around it promised exclusivity. Dialogue in these moments layered with subtext. "They will eat this up," Ava said, breathless. "They love the idea of me living an elevated life." Her friend Lena replied, "Exactly, and you look so good doing it." The scene tasted of champagne and success, of cotton dresses and salted air. Ava's receipts were long and luminous. Marcus's ledger read like a campaign for social access. He called Noah a gallery owner and negotiated a private showing. "We want to be seen in the right rooms," he told him. "Send 3 names. We will take care of the rest." He paid consultants, bought advertising space in a trade journal, and sponsored a luncheon where an influential editor was present. Each charge had an intent, the texture of a plan. "It is not just spending," Marcus reminded an intern named Grace when she questioned its ethics. "It is leverage. It is currency we trade for influence." The words fell crisp, almost metallic on the office air. Rosa's bills were humble and full of sound that did not travel far. She bought a box of powdered milk for a family with a newborn whose mother worked nights at the bodega. She paid for a small fixer-upper at the recommendation of a neighbor, a place to quietly store things and keep rain off a sagging roof. She spent time at a soup kitchen, paying for extra ingredients and a new set of ladles that rang when hit. Rosa's choices smelled of simmering onions and old soap. When she handed a bag of fruit to a little boy on the corner, he looked up with a grin that had 2 missing teeth and spoke her name like a blessing. "Rosa," the boy said, "you are a blessing." She laughed, and the sound was like coins, simple and real. Ethan watched the incoming reports through a secure app and reclined into a memory that explained why this mattered to him. He had not always been a man who distrusted sincerity. He grew up in a small coastal town where his father taught him how to measure a board twice and cut once. As a child, he learned the geometry of makeshift repairs, how to mend a broken hinge with patience. He left that town with a scholarship and a heavy sense of responsibility. At university, he studied engineering and then business, and the first company he founded sold a small piece of software that meant survival for a clinic in his hometown. When that clinic closed because of funding cuts, he blamed systems, not people, and it hardened him. He learned to count success in contracts and headlines, and along the way, relationships became performances. The childhood kitchen smelled of fish and salt. The university lab smelled of solvent. The boardrooms smelled like expensive coffee and indifference. His losses were not always public. He had been engaged once, and the engagement ended with a move to Singapore and 2 short emails, leaving him to wonder what parts of himself had been negotiable. He kept that backstory close because it explained why he needed proof. He had built shelters of logic around his heart. He had money and influence and a private fatigue. At night, he would look at pictures of himself with politicians and pundits and feel a small, sharp ache. In the present, that ache became a test. Could spending ever reveal authenticity, or would it only reinforce the costumes people wore? These memories smelled of frying oil and printer ink, and they made him strict, skeptical, and ultimately curious enough to stage what he called the experiment. The first moment of high tension came when the small app pinged and a receipt appeared from a luxury charity gala attended by Ava. The amount was enormous, and so was the guest photo that popped up, Ava laughing with a donor who had donated for exposure more than for the mission. Ethan's chest tightened. He replayed the footage of her entering the gala, the soft murmur of cameras, the velvet scraping. He remembered a childhood scene of his father paying a debt with a handshake and a look that promised follow-through. He had to decide whether to confront Ava publicly or to wait until the end. The choice felt like cutting a cable that held a chandelier over a crowded room. He sat silent, the apartment air conditioner humming, and formed a plan that felt both petty and necessary. Ava arrived at the penthouse with perfume and petals in her hair. Ethan placed a receipt book on the marble between them. "You looked beautiful," he said first, a sentence small enough to be true. "Thank you," Ava replied, fingers hovering over the paper. "Why did you do this?" she asked later, after a flute of champagne, when the camera flashes were only an echo. "To see what you would be when given the chance," he answered. The conversation elongated into subtext. "You wanted a show," Ava accused, eyes bright. "I wanted to know who you are," Ethan said, "and the room tasted like the last sip of a meal someone else had finished for you." Marcus was the next to be probed, not with a gloved hand, but with the blunt instrument of public image. Ethan had compiled a list of invoices showing payments for introductions that led to editorial coverage disguised as partnerships. He slid the folder toward Marcus in the glass-walled conference room. "Were these transactions for the company or for placement?" he asked, voice even. Marcus inhaled and then launched into a defense, dialogue that sounded rehearsed. "Ethan, you know how this works," Marcus said. "Place us where the audience sees us and we win." "At what cost?" Ethan asked. Marcus named names, spoke of pressure from investors, of a campaign needing momentum. He tried to argue that what he did was in service of growth. The debate tasted of coffee and stale ambition, and outside the glass, the city moved on, unaware. The second moment of high tension came when a journalist reached out with a whistleblower's tip about the gala donation being earmarked for tax write-offs. The message arrived at midnight like a small animal. Ethan read the words and felt the floor tilt. He had not intended to summon this public consequence, and suddenly his private test smelled of gasoline and possibility. He sat, fingers white, on the edge of the couch, hearing the refrigerator click and the distant clack of a garbage truck. He considered calling the journalist and correcting him, or letting the story breathe. The internal debate replayed old wounds about reputation and humility, and a small instinct told him that silence might be louder than a press release. Meanwhile, Rosa kept acting as if she had nothing to prove. She paid for a week's worth of lunchboxes at a community school and arranged for a retired teacher named Linda to help with evening tutoring. She bought a camera for a teenage boy who drew maps for a living but had never seen his work in print. She carried a coat with neatly sewed men's and walked into places where her purchases produced immediate warmth. "We cannot feed everyone," she told a neighbor named Carlos as they walked home with bags, "but we can feed some, and that matters." Her receipts were receipts, nothing more, but they carried a tiny, persistent light. The third moment of high tension was a phone call at dinner that could not be ignored. An anonymous influencer had compiled the transactions into a post that suggested manipulation. Ethan's phone buzzed across the table, and the world narrowed to a notification. He saw thumbnails of Ava laughing, of Marcus shaking hands under glass, and of Rosa handing over a packet of napkins. The post framed the experiment as a social media stunt, and the comments were a chorus, some outraged, some amused, many hungry for spectacle. Ethan felt exposed and foolish. He could ignore it and let the receipts speak, or he could convene a dinner where truth would have to be performed, where he would confront the three of them and allow their choices to stand or fall. He called for the dinner. The night of the confrontation felt like walking into a theater where the curtains had already been burned away. The table was set under a lamp that made the faces beneath it sharp. Marcus took his seat with a practiced smile. Ava arrived later, hair glossy, energy crackling like fireplace sparks. Rosa walked in with a slow calm and placed a small paper bag at Ethan's place, like an offering. The dinner began with polite remarks that scraped the surface. "This meal is nice," Ava said, lifting her glass. "It is," Rosa replied, a pause heavy enough to press against. They exchanged ponderances of speech, 8 to 10 interchanges that shifted tone from small talk to accusation to explanation. "You asked for receipts," Ethan began. "I gave you receipts," Marcus said quickly. "They were strategic," he added. "You could have used it for charity," Ethan replied. Charity does not build brands, Ava countered sharply. It can, Rosa said softly, and then told a story about the boy with missing teeth who learned to read because someone bought him a book. The room smelled of roasted meat and citrus, and every felt like a small excavation. As the evening wore on, it became clear that visibility had different currencies. Ava needed applause to feel real. Marcus converted attention into leverage, sometimes forgetting the edges of ethics. Rosa spent in ways that repaired immediate harm and never looked for a camera. The confrontation was raw because it made visible what each person had chosen when outside eyes were not watching. Ethan listened more than he spoke. His silence was part of the judgment. He realized that his experiment had not revealed a single villain, but a map of needs and faults. He had wanted proof and discovered complexity. After the dinner, changes began in small, stubborn ways that nonetheless accumulated. Ethan could have fired Marcus for the compromises he made, or he could have cut ties with Ava and retreated into solitude. But he did something more complicated and harder to explain. He asked Rosa to lead a new initiative that would be funded from a portion of his philanthropic budget. He asked Marcus to audit the flow of sponsorships and to present a transparency protocol from the inside. He spoke to Ava about authenticity and asked her to spend more time volunteering with the projects rather than selling the moments. He made mistakes along the way and apologized publicly for the experiment's spectacle, acknowledging that curiosity had a cost that fell unevenly on people who deserved privacy. 1 month later, the first signs of change appeared. The initiative Rosa named Neighborhood Threads had a modest office and a small staff that included Linda and the teenage boy with the camera, now part of a visual storytelling team. The space smelled of garlic and printing ink, and the walls were hung with maps and photographs that people had donated. Rosa managed food drives and mending circles, and Ethan visited once, hands in the flower of a community kitchen, feeling awkward and grateful. Marcus presented a report on new transparency procedures that were messy and bureaucratic, but real enough to keep some bad practices at bay. Ava posted a short, unsponsored video about a tutoring session she sat through, her captions honest and without filters. The public conversation cooled from outrage to curiosity, and a few donors redirected funds to Neighborhood Threads because they saw photographs of children learning to read. 3 months later, the program had multiplied its reach. The tutoring program partnered with a local school and reported measurable improvements in attendance. Rosa hired 2 part-time coordinators, one named Grace and one named Raj, who handled logistics and recruitment. Ethan allocated a recurring grant and set up a simple online ledger where anyone could see how funds were spent, a move that earned cautious praise from local papers. Marcus shifted roles to head of community partnerships and spent his days negotiating volunteer time and pro bono services from firms that once competed for placement fees. Ava continued to share parts of the work, sometimes clumsy, sometimes beautiful, and slowly, the public began to accept that her presence had changed from performance to practice. 6 months after the test, something like a new normal had taken hold. Neighborhood Threads operated from a renovated storefront with shelves of donated books and a kitchen where soup was served at noon. The teenage photographer had a small show at Noah's Gallery and donated proceeds to a scholarship fund. Linda ran an evening literacy circle and was given a small stipend. Ethan had stepped back from the front lines and provided funding along with a governance board that included Carlos and Julia and other community members, so decisions could be made by those directly affected. He learned to speak less and to listen more. Marcus still slipped sometimes into old habits, but his ledger was public and he faced accountability. Ava slowly cultivated a series of posts that focused on the people she met rather than the outfits she wore, and her followers responded with curiosity rather than just applause. The legacy of the bizarre purchase was not a tidy moral, but a messy set of outcomes that reflected human complication. Money had nudged behavior, but it did not contain morality. Rosa's purchases had been small but catalytic, a reminder that modest acts can have ripple effects. Ethan did not become saintly overnight, but he did turn a test into a commitment and transformed a private curiosity into a public project that produced real change. In 1 month, Neighborhood Threads had a functioning team. In 3 months, local schools recorded improved attendance. In 6 months, the program had inspired 2 neighboring districts to replicate elements of the model. People who had once been players in Ethan's orbit became partners in a small, imperfect movement toward repair. If this story moved you, share it with someone who thinks that money alone buys virtue. Subscribe to follow more stories where choices matter more than image, and where ordinary people may reveal the extraordinary. The receipts will still exist, and so will the memories, but the final measure is what got built after the test ended. Character does not come with a receipt, but it shows up in how we spend our lives.